So we're joined today by Barry Chandler, founder of Tech Legacy, and Benedict Dodd, co-founder of Armakuni. My name is Reka Rockler, and I'll be your host for today. You'll notice throughout the webinar today, we're going to have our Q&A box open. So please make use of having both Barry and Benedict with us and ask lots of questions. Towards the end of the webinar, we'll be hosting a Q&A session, and we'll try to get as many of those answered for you as possible. So today, Barry and Ben are going to be discussing why now, what to measure and how, and what leaders, teams, and individuals can do. Sustainability, greenwashing, and all things climate are hot topics, so it's going to be great to hear Barry and Ben's thoughts. I know it's going to be a great session, so I'm going to hand over to Barry and Benedict to get us started.
Brilliant, thank you, Reka. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Dodd. I'm a co-founder at Armakuni. I'm a consulting CTO, leading outcomes with clients who are either scale-ups or really large regulated organizations. I spend my time in healthcare, so places like the NHS, in energy and renewables, but also in large financial regulated environments. We are really lucky to have Barry with us today. He's created not one, but two of my favorite communities in our industry. So welcome, Barry.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Hi there, everyone. So for the last 7 years, I've been building communities with thousands of members, organising and curating enterprise agility related events to basically help organisations adapt faster and deliver more value to their customers and various stakeholders. This overlapped for the first 5 of those years with the time I spent working at Barclays Investment Bank, where I started off in 2001 as an application engineer and progressed into other roles, including a site reliability engineer, delivery lead, enterprise architect, and co-chair of the group-wide DevOps community of practice. Approximately 3 years ago, I became increasingly concerned how enterprises have become very wasteful in terms of managing their cloud infrastructure. In many cases, giving cloud providers money literally for nothing. Then I started to think about this and other technology waste in terms of energy efficiency and carbon emissions, and it blew my mind thinking about it and all the opportunities we all have to reduce our energy consumption. I created ourtechlegacy.org to share my mind-blown moments with like-minded people and for them to do the same. As well as building the community, we've created a workshop and certification program to help organisations reduce their energy costs and carbon footprint across their technology functions. Today, alongside Ben, I hope to share some of my insights and tell you a bit more about the workshops, as well as hearing some stories from people like you attending the webinar. Just a bit of a heads up, I'm not dancing to any music that you can't hear. I've actually got Parkinson's, so I might shake a bit like you from time to time, depending upon how balanced my medication is. But if you could look past that, that'd be great.
Brilliant, thank you, Barry. So as Reka said, we're going to focus on these 4 areas. So why we should, why we must, what's the call to action right now? How do we measure where we currently are, where we need to get to? How do we build awareness around what that journey might look like? And then what are the certain things that we can do right now? And then what are the things we can start to do next? So we mentioned greenwashing in the title, and maybe this was news to me, this has not been a constant theme. So we really started out with greenwashing, and this was companies pretending to be greener than they were. But actually this then moved on to green hushing. And this was firms that would started to pretend they were less green for fear of being seen to be greenwashing. So almost a step back in terms of what people were trying to talk about and publicize. And now there's a danger that we're in this green botching phase, which is where there is these really well-meant environmental measures, but they're being implemented so badly that they are backfiring. They are not having the impact that they hoped they would have. And then when we think about the sort of call to action, what we're trying to address and where we're going to reduce those emissions, we're really thinking about maybe offsets or elimination. greenwashing maybe has a bit of a tendency to show up in this offset side of things, but the main search space that we're going to have for solutions is going to be on the right-hand side. It's going to be abatement and elimination, reducing the actual carbon that we are creating. So this key question of why we should now and why we must, and the answer is, the climate. This is the villain of our story. I'm not going to spend too much time going into this, other than we've got this projected point around 2040, even though it's a bit of a window. It could happen sooner than that, and it could happen slightly later than that. But in terms of this 1.5 degree increase, this is what we're tracking towards. So not a lot of time and a real call to action now. In terms of the organizations, ESG, environmental, social governance, is right at the top of corporate agendas at the moment. It's a really critical place. And there are new regulations that are on the immediate horizon in many geographies around the globe. So ESG is also a cross-cutting concern. It's not going to be down to one department. It's not going to be just the reporting function or the finance components of organizations. There's going to have to be a mobilization across the whole enterprise as we start to address this ESG, environmental, social, and governance perspective. We're also seeing that organizations, in order to make progress against this target, are seeing these in their core objectives. So senior leaders within organizations are seeing this both in their objectives, but also increasingly in their remuneration incentivization packages. So they are seeing this as a really core thing that they are going to have to focus on. In terms of that journey actually to net zero, there aren't any clear regulations which are going to map out that entire journey from where we are now to where we need to get to, but they are coming soon. So if we think about right now what we do have the beginnings of greenwashing regulations, so what people can actually say about what they are doing, what they are measuring, the changes that they are having. So that's a real first step. We have regulation in place, and this is only going to get stronger around reporting on the amount of carbon that is being produced currently as a first step. And then the step after that, which is one that's really on the horizon in the next 1, 2 or so years, is that visibility of what the strategy is for the organization to make that actual transition from their reported amount of carbon now to where they need to get to, and a clear sense of actually how they're going to do that. There is also, there were stories recently in the press around this sense of carbon leakage, that we're going to have laws and regulation in place just to stop people moving their carbon consumption around the planet, and to move it across international borders. So we're really seeing regulation and fines for the prevention of that sort of thing, that once we know where the carbon is produced, then we can start to mitigate, and it's no use just sort of moving that around the planet. And so the next step is really, what is the taxation, penalties, and enforcement? And this is definitely the least clear. There is some, if you look in terms of the UK, we're quite likely to look to Europe. Europe are probably ahead of us in terms of this. And they do have a focus perhaps more on something like agriculture, where they're starting to reason about how they're going to put the penalties and enforcement in place on that. And that, if we don't have a very clear sense of a strategy and the current thing, could be based on something as crude as just market capitalization. So just the size of the organization, the wealth of the organization, and we'll say there'll be a penalty per whatever it might be in terms of market cap. So if we don't have those sort of initial steps in place, then we could see ourselves with some very crude implementation in terms of penalties and enforcement. So a question to you, Barry, is this consistent with what you've seen and what you've heard in your interactions with organizations?
Thanks, Ben. I'd say in summary, I see a similar story as you mentioned. Like ESG really can no longer be, in my opinion, a side of the desk activity to appease like the Green Brigade. Like it's becoming a fundamental requirement for all businesses, which can easily define success or failure. Let me talk about that in a little bit more detail, though. So, in terms of general lack of awareness, Most people on the planet have the ability to be online and enjoy all the things that come with that. However, most people, I don't think, understand that everything we do, which involves the internet, has a cost associated with it in terms of energy consumed, and as a consequence, like a carbon cost. They don't see all the interactions and processes that take place in order to service their request. For example, an average email without an attachment generates approximately 0.3 grams of CO2 emissions, which may not seem a lot, but when you multiply that up by 4.5 billion users of email globally, the emissions start to become rather scary. A similar lack of awareness applies within organisations. People just aren't aware that in most instances, what they work with, when they work with technology, there is an impact on the environment as a result of the devices they use consuming energy. They don't see the plumes of smoke coming from power stations every time they do something. And this lack of awareness is the first challenge that must be overcome, in my opinion. One way of creating the required awareness is through the introduction of government targets and legislation, which you talked about a bit, Ben, which over the last few years will become increasingly, over the next few years, will become increasingly stricter and more impactful to enterprises all over the world. So just to clarify, the UK has committed to being carbon neutral by 2050, and in addition to that, has committed to reducing carbon emissions by 78% compared to 1990 levels by 2035, which really isn't that far away given the size of the problem that most organisations face. So many of the regulations coming into scope are broadly aligned with global frameworks, such as those proposed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSBTM, and the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, the latter forming part of the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, not to be confused with CSDR. Don't you just love an acronym? Anyway, most of the legislation involves reporting and not direct penalties relating to activities which are deemed to be too damaging for the carbon emissions perspective. But as Ben said, it's only a matter of time before they come, basically. In North America, the reporting is not purely based upon carbon emissions. It also includes reporting on how the organisations intend to achieve their carbon neutral requirements. Similarly, in Europe, companies will be required to report on the organisation's impact to the environment. So the implications of this level of scrutiny are forcing companies to start acting now or face much bigger challenges the longer they do nothing. Aside from this, these disclosures will affect companies' abilities to obtain investment, attract and retain customers, as well as hire top talent. This explains why senior executives are more aware of what's going on than people on the coalface, by and large. And they're increasingly being given sustainability objectives, as Ben outlined earlier. And some of the pilot workshops we've been involved with large enterprises have specifically requested to create the awareness across the senior technology leadership team. So there is a collective understanding as to the size of the problem. To me, this makes me feel that we're at the very start of a wave of significant change for all businesses with technology at the heart of it. So expect to see these objectives to ripple down through your organisation very soon. And many organisations expect to see the efforts to move to a much more energy aware culture, which is the first thing that we deal with in our workshop.
Great. So there's this, now we've got the sense of what you can't measure, you can't improve. So this is going to be a really core part of just understanding where we are now, what the sort of scale of the challenge is, and where we need to, then we can start to think of what that path forward looks like. So I guess first of all, a couple of terminology things. Carbon or CO2 equivalent is the the unit that is most often used. So for example, a ton of methane, so which is not carbon dioxide, obviously, has the same warming effect as about 80 tons of CO2. So we can normalize that down to 80 tons of CO2 equivalent. So this is really important measure that we can all understand, and it can cover these multiple greenhouse gases without adding further complexity to that. So that's probably an important thing to understand. The other thing is that the greenhouse gas protocol is the thing that is used by 92% of Fortune 500. So really used by most, if not all people. And this is a thing that is going to divide the emissions down into these three scopes: one around the direct emissions, one the indirect emissions, and scope 3, which is other indirect emissions. And scope 3 is sometimes referred to as the value chain emissions. And this is a really significant source of emissions, but it's also the most complex to calculate for many organizations, and therefore probably the most complex to do anything about in terms of that path forward. The other thing to understand in terms of measuring the energy that we're using is that not all electricity is born equal. If the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, it could be the actual carbon intensity of the electricity that is being used is much lower, significantly lower. In this case, a third the carbon input. So understanding not all electricity is equal is important. And what's also interesting, and this is sort of, I think, an alarming thing I understood when I started to work more with renewables, is that in terms of balancing demand and supply on the national grid, it's actually the renewables that are much easier to start and stop. So if there is a reduction on demand on the grid, for example, the gas and the coal will be kept generating, and the suppliers who are controlling the wind estates or the solar farms, they're the ones that are going to be able to ask to stop. So actually, that sudden reduction in demand can mean the carbon intensity goes up dramatically. And I would definitely recommend these two applications. So not least because they're quite good fun. My children are actually really addicted to tracking these. But so the one on the left, an application that tells you what, in terms of the national grid in the UK, there are other ones internationally, but where is the electricity actually coming from? So in our house, we make decisions about when we charge the electric car or when we put the washing machine on and all those sorts of things. And then on the one on the right is the forecast. So you can actually see over the next 2 or so days what the carbon intensity of the energy supply is going to be. So then you can start to make decisions into the future in the coming days about what you're doing. And in our house, we're doing our workload balance depending on the car and other big energy consumers in our house. But that is equally true of us running estates. For example, you could see, looking out into the forecast, that the consumption of public cloud in the US is currently less green, so we can move that workload somewhere else, or we can move the workload from in the daytime to in the evening. So that sort of non-time critical stuff can start to move around either the planet or the calendar. So Barry, is it how important is it to measure, and then how do you think we should get started?
So Ben, I think measuring an organisation's carbon footprint, is extremely difficult at the moment, and is an area that we really need to spend a lot of time on to accurately and transparently report the correct data in a consistent way, so that everyone can easily see where any enterprise is at. At the moment, there seems to be a lot of ambiguity around scope 3 requirements in particular. For example, scope 3 is meant to include energy consumption data generated by its employees. But to my knowledge, I don't know anyone who's been asked to share their energy bills with their employer in order to provide accurate figures, when considering many people are still working from home, as well as being back in the office. My interest, though, is more around measuring energy efficiency at a granular level, which will allow teams who support specific services or applications to understand their energy costs relative to other teams, as well as potentially similar apps or services outside of the organisation. Other people, though, that are focused on more product-related energy costs. And for example, in financial services, the energy cost of processing a trade carried out on a given exchange from trade capture to settlement. Whilst this is interesting, the reason why I'm focusing on the energy costs of services and applications is because, in my opinion, this will provide a better basis for optimizing energy efficiency and will help teams bake energy efficiency into their delivery processes. With that in mind, it's really important to apply a scientific, evidence-based approach when measuring energy consumption as part of delivery. However, measuring a service or application's energy efficiency is complicated due to the fact that the majority of delivery teams are delivering their software on virtual servers these days. So kind of working out what part of the energy consumption of a server equates to like a team or a service or application is quite difficult. There are some energy measuring frameworks such as Scafandra, and I think we will share a link to that. It's on GitHub. Scafandra, I think, is the name of one of those deep sea diving helmets from days gone, peace past. But we're sending a link to that for you. It's worth looking at. But it's still quite in its infancy, and a bit more work is required on it. But I think it is a useful starting point. One thing I feel strongly about, though, is about it's important not to get too bogged down with consistency, consistent measures at this stage of the game. I believe it's more important to get things done, particularly the no-brainer improvements, such as shutting down your development and test instances out of office hours and at the weekend, rather than waiting for standards to emerge around energy efficiency measurement, which could be some time. In our workshop, we focus on actions rather than procrastination.
Great. So then we've got some sense of how we can measure this. And then really is, how do we start to build the awareness that we need? And Barry, as someone who's mobilized 2 fantastic communities, what's your advice on how do we harness the power for change?
Good question, Ben. My first piece of advice for creating effective communities within organisations is to get the leadership sponsorship from the outset and set clear expectations as to what that should involve. It's really important that leaders are driving the energy efficiency culture and are communicating this message across the whole organisation, requesting everyone to get on board with it. In order to achieve this, it requires consistent education and training, which is a gap at the moment for most organisations, and which is where the workshop fits in. In addition to culture, it focuses on several architecture viewpoints, including platform, application, data, business, and enterprise. Providing examples of energy efficiency practices which can be adopted or tailored to meet the needs of most applications. Initially, your green tech or DevGreenOps community, or whatever you call it, may cover all of these viewpoints, but for larger organisations, I would expect them to evolve into their own communities. Providing training, which is easy enough for everyone to understand in technology, is really important in order for bringing people together and sharing experiences. I think that's key, right? Creating an organisational community where everyone can contribute is a proven approach to delivering better software faster. Our Tech Legacy is building an external community and certification to complement the workshop and support your efforts towards a carbon neutral future by sharing across many organisations and industries, sharing knowledge transfer, I should say, and experiences. In addition to the knowledge sharing, we value action over talk, as I mentioned earlier, and delivery partners such as Armakuni, who can bring the communities together if required. The final word I'll say, which again is extremely important, is that ESG cannot be a side of the desk activity, as I mentioned earlier, or just a nice to have. In order to normalise these practices, associated communities must be adequately funded.
Great. So I'm just sort of keeping an eye on the questions, and there's sort of a lot of the questions really are focused on the what can we do? What can the various personas across the organization do right now? So we'll answer hopefully some questions at the end and maybe answer some on the way. So I think the first thing that I would say is there's no need to feel useless. There are already communities and organizations that are focused on solutions, and certainly the community that events that I've gone into in London are very focused on this is not a group to come together to moan about the current state that we are and how difficult it's going to be. There are people that are actually looking at the size of the challenge ahead of us and how we can focus on that, and really what are the things that we can do right now. And I would also say, as someone that's been part of this community and this industry for 20 or so years, that we are full of innovators and we are full of storytellers, and we have got the capability and the mindsets to actually tackle this problem. The problem, I think, is to the scale of we need a 6% year-on-year reduction, which I think is achievable. And I think we've got the people to do that. And I especially see this having gone through the sort of the technical reaction to the pandemic and the ability for industries and organizations to come together extremely rapidly and see, medical solutions and technical solutions being evolved over days and weeks that may have previously taken months and years. So I take great encouragement from that experience and that set of interaction. And this was also like a really important idea for me, that every job is now a climate job. I think this is a really powerful idea and a really useful mindset to have, both as someone who has a job, I have a job, and now I'm thinking to myself, my job is now a climate job. So what does that mean? How's that going to affect my daily interactions and planning and strategic decisions that I make within my business and with the clients that I work with? And obviously, as someone that is creating roles or has teams of teams, then how are these roles also going to be climate jobs? What needs to be in their definition? What needs to be in their objective to meet this challenge? And I also think there's a latent army of contributors. There is lots of people across the whole industry that may not used to being this close to the front line for this type of change. And it's an approachable problem. There are things that people can do, that teams can do, that organizations can do without needing to wait, without a dependency on somewhere else. So I think there's a sense that maybe if people haven't been sort of change agents and innovators before, now there's a real opportunity. There's a problem that we can look to address. I think that's a really powerful idea. And I think there's also really good news. I think the values that we have found in cloud native development and DevOps and FinOps are all highly aligned to energy sustainability. Things like, are we using the minimum data set for the lowest possible lifespan? Do we have the smallest estate in terms of the servers that we are currently running? Are they scaled down? As Barry said, are we pausing and killing over the weekend out of hours? But I think all those valuables and the technical approaches are all in there, but we need to get to the point where we're really exploiting that technology. Lots of organizations that I've seen and that I work with are probably at the moment at that point where they're sort of lifting and shifting those things into the cloud. They're not really exploiting the fact that the promise of the cloud is that you can turn it off, that you can reduce your estate, and all those sorts of things. We need to exploit that technology to a greater extent than they currently are, and that is already baked into DevOps and FinOps and things we sort of know about, but we just need to take it to the next level. But I think also with the addition of a new stakeholder, the climate has got to be a stakeholder at those tables. When we are doing planning sessions, we are doing inception processes, the stakeholder needs to be present as the climate. What does the climate need from this new product? What do they need from this new service for it to be impactful? And there's also a chance that there's, there's not more than a chance, there's an evolution of DevOps and automation. All the things that we have done to automate how technology is created and distributed and managed across the place has become increasingly easy with automation, but has that meant that we are shipping a lot more data, consuming a lot more energy than we strictly need to, just become it's so easy to move the whole thing as opposed to incremental updates, for example. And in terms of, I think something that everyone could do now, there's this, the Green Software Practitioners course is free. It's relatively short. It's very well articulated, and it does talk through in a bit more detail lots of the things that we've mentioned in the session today. So I think in terms of just getting started, if you haven't looked at this and you haven't done something like this, I think this or something like this, and there are a couple of others which we'll share links to after this webinar, I would maybe be looking at that as something to get started. So Barry, a question for you. So what can people do now, and what really can they do next?
Thanks, Ben. So I probably really got to say that everyone's got a role to play, just echoing what you said. Like starting with like simple things like your email management, like you clear up your inbox, stop sending like megabyte documents around, like just send a link to them. I think like little things like that are things that everyone can do, like in an organization, and they do make a difference. So and if you're in a leadership position, you should be assessing where the organization is relative to where they need to be from an ESG perspective. Leaders need to define, fund and support sustainability strategies which focus on energy efficiency, which meet the legal requirements and deadlines at a minimum, but ideally they should be done as soon as practically possible. So sustainability strategies should focus on the short, medium and long term. In the short term, we need to be actioning the quick wins, which give us the biggest bang for the buck, like we've talked quite a bit about, like stopping and starting our dev and test instances, like over the weekend and out of hours. To give you a bit of insight, when I did that at Barclays, or helped a team do that at Barclays, they reduced their costs by £20,000 a month. Yeah, and so that's like nearly £250,000 a year, and like if you multiply that up by many other teams in the business, it certainly works out to being quite a lot of money. And not just that, but also like carbon reduction in the carbon footprint. In the medium term, we should be looking at more challenging tasks, such as managing our resiliency in more efficient ways. For example, using active-active approaches where services are run across multiple data centers, so that if one were to go down, the other data centers would automatically pick up the additional workloads. This is opposed to how many applications manage resiliency at the moment, which typically involves having replica environments idle awaiting a disaster. Yeah, and don't need to probably go into why that's very efficient. But obviously the first way of doing things active is much better. Other examples, as Ben alluded to, of medium-term activities include re-architecting your applications which hold data from day one to only require the smallest subset of data necessary. I mean, where I'm going with this is that storage costs, and it requires energy to actually keep in place as well, right? And a book worth reading about that is Jerry McGovern's Worldwide Waste, and it talks about if we carry on like we are, then it's we're not going to have enough space on the planet to store all this data. So lastly, longer term actions include collapsing duplicate systems into one or as few as possible, and adjusting legacy infrastructure and software which do not lend themselves to take advantage of modern technology practices such as autoscaling or DevOps, which have got these green kind of baked into them already. So these are just a few things that we cover in the workshop to help organisations get to where they need to be and highlight how everyone's got a role to play. For most organisations, I really think that the level of transformation required is a massive effort, which is why it's important to make energy efficiency and ESG a priority.
Great. So that's really in terms of the content for us to talk through. So we've gone through these stages. We said we've given some visibility on the likely progress of regulation some visibility of some terminology, some basic tools where we can start to measure the impact that we are having, the importance of awareness and how building that awareness inside and outside the organization is very important, and some sense of what we can do at the various levels of the organization. And we said it that bit at the beginning around the ESG is not going to be an impact focused on one part of the organization. It's going to really span the entire organization, and this sort of sense that every job is a climate job, and what is that actually going to mean for everyone as we start to make this progress. So we do have some questions. I don't know if Rake is jumping back in.
I am here. Thank you, Barry and Ben. That was really insightful. I don't know about everybody else, but my head's certainly exploding. So thank you all for sharing some of those questions in the meantime, though. I'll kick off. There are a number. I'm conscious of time and I don't think we'll get through all of them. So if we don't worry, we'll put a written response together and include that as part of the recording, but we'll try and get through as many as we can now. I'm just going to go in order. So I'm going to kick off with, we're not currently doing anything in our org, brackets that I'm aware of. How do I get started? So quite a broad question, and one that's come up actually a few times, but yeah, what should people be doing? Ben, do you want to take that first?
I think, yeah, the point I was probably trying to make on the slide when I was talking about FinOps, which is about exploiting and optimizing the use of the cloud, or DevOps, which is about fast flow and using technology to get that really fast flow, is there's probably a certain amount that is actually already being done in terms of optimizing the energy that we're using and those sorts of things, or at least those ideas are present. So I'd say they are in there already. And I think if you just looked into even those practices, approaches to, as Barry was saying, the delivery of software, the creation of software, how it's then managed in production, if we're really exploiting to that sort of into the right level, even within those existing bodies of research and those existing cultures, there's a huge amount of work that's probably already been done, and there's probably already an existing roadmap to how we can go in further, how we can start to further exploit. So I think some sense of, I think I would be thinking in terms of when we're mobilizing new products or new services, literally when we're doing our stakeholder mapping, we're going to want to see the climate as a stakeholder on there. So even when we're just thinking strategically about how we're going to reason about this service, what does this stakeholder want from this activity, from this service? And then what, in terms of our delivery process, how are we just measuring what we're doing? How much, what's the size of our estate? When is it running? How much CO2 equivalent is it actually consuming, just as a base measure? And then we can look to make progress against that. Feels like I've talked for a while. Barry, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to join Extinction Rebellion to make a difference, right? Like, like everyone can start doing stuff now. Just like, hopefully this webinar is kind of giving you a bit of food for thought and giving you the sense that you can do something. Like, and just think about what you do. Like and just think about like that even if you're not measuring it at the moment, like I think you probably got a rough idea, like that whether something might be efficient or not. Like digitizing like your processes, like is key. Like I'll give you an example, like from Barclays, where, and they're not the only one. I think every investment bank does this. They're still sending out paper confirmations for trades to certain clients. So like overnight, a batch run, a batch report gets produced. The confirmations get sent to a printer. They get printed out. They get put in envelopes. They get air-mailed like all over the world. And all that is necessary really in that situation is to switch it over to like email confirmations, which is a lot of these things are, as Ben said, are probably in place already. It's a case of just like thinking about like how like the processes and things you're doing, which could be energy inefficient at the moment, and working out what you could do with them as quickly as possible.
Brilliant, thank you, Barry and Ben. pick the next one. This is interesting. There are lots of aspects of sustainability, only one of which is energy. Is it more important to prioritize this over and above other areas? Who would like to take that?
Can I take that?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I just think like energy efficiency is a good starting point. Like, like reducing the amount of like energy you're consuming and keeping it down to a minimum is surely like going to be the better for everyone. Bill Bullen, who's the CEO of the Utilita, I think, he was quoted last year as saying like the best way or the only way of dealing with the climate crisis and energy security is to use this, right? And I just think like rather than spending millions of pounds on how we can create more resources to use like in a frivolous manner, like the more we like focus on what we do and try and like reduce it, I think that is the starting point.
Yeah, and obviously I think we've probably focused on this talk in terms of just sort of the energy in terms of consumption when services are running and the electricity, but obviously that also will cover the manufacture of the hardware that we're running and that whole process. So it's not to say we're just focusing on electricity that is then consumed by servers and the servers have come from somewhere which we don't really know or are too worried about. So it does cover all that, I think. And certainly in our industry, an understanding of good proxy measures for a broader area of concerns are really useful. And I think energy and energy efficiency might be a good proxy for a lot of different concerns that if we took them all individually would be quite difficult. So certainly just understanding sort of energy consumption and the carbon impact of that energy is a proxy that, covers lots of other aspects in terms of our efficiency and our approaches and our architectures and all those sorts of things. So certainly not the only one, but I think on the lookout for those proxies is always really useful and impactful.
I'm conscious of time and we don't have enough time to go through the remainder of the questions. So I'm just going to pick one, which I need a 30-second response from both of you. And I'm going to pick one that I think is probably quite easy to answer. The data you've shared is pretty scary and overwhelming. Does it really matter whether I'm doing something or not? Ben, do you want to go first?
I don't know, Barry's probably got a good answer. He's probably thinking about it right now.
No, just don't do anything. Keep your head in the sand and see what happens. Obviously, I'm joking. Like everything we do, right, matters. Like everything. Even being on this call matters. There's an energy cost to it, but I think in this instance, it's worthwhile because we create an awareness which should hopefully reduce like your carbon footprint. But I created our tech legacy. Really, the name like really is all about one thing. We got a decision to make. Like our generation has got a really important decision to make. As I mentioned earlier, we can either forget all of this stuff is happening around us and how it's accelerating, or and just carry on with our normal lives and be in blissful ignorance for a period of time, or we can really acknowledge that that climate. The climate is a concern for everyone and for my children, right? And probably a lot of your children.
Yeah.
We can decide.
Barry, we're tight on time, so thank you for your input. Ben, do you have anything to quickly wrap up?
I think we're at the sort of tipping point where it's still about us having a responding that we can use our innovation and our ability to respond a bit like we did in the pandemic. And that we need 6% of the solution now, and then we need the next 6%, and then the next 6%, and that sort of compound impact is going to build over time. We shouldn't feel like we need the entire solution right now. We just need to make a good amount of progress now and then build on that. So I think there's still an opportunity to innovate towards an impact and a solution, But obviously, as we also said, the regulation is also coming, and we're probably going to, businesses and organizations and leaders are going to find themselves being mandated to react. So even if you just chuck the stick approach to the situation, starting to understand the impact of that and how we need to ready ourselves for that in the coming days and weeks, I think is also incredibly important, even if you just sort of put the climate side to one side.
Perfect, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. There are still some questions. We'll put together some responses and share those along with the recording of today's conversation. Both Barry and Ben referenced some useful apps and some links, which we'll also try to share with you. Barry and Ben, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and for everyone that's tuned in or watching on a recording, thank you so much. Hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.